Ukraine's recent military offensives have upended many people's expectations of how Russia's invasion will end. Western supporters have been pleasantly surprised by Ukraine's successes east of Kharkiv. That is nothing, however, compared to the complete surprise of Russian observers. As Ukraine recaptured more territory in 2 weeks than Russia had gained in 6 months, Russian television was littered with analysts attempting to cope in real time with the cognitive dissonance of failure. Russian shock at the country's reversals on the battlefield is unsurprising. Russian experts have inculcated a fair number of myths about the war and the broader state of the world in the 7 months since the start of war. As Columbia political scientist Jack Snyder noted in his book Myths of Empire, self-serving nationalist stories that make territorial conquest sound easy are common in regimes that mix elements of autocracy and democracy. This holds with particular force for Russia. A combination of sanctions, visa restrictions, and voluntary cutoffs have severed most exchanges between Russia and the West. High-level contact has been minimal. According to the Yale School of Management, around 1,000 multinational corporations have pulled back or shut down their Russia operations. Similarly, almost all academic partnerships have been severed by Western universities. Within Russia, domestic political opposition to the war has been ruthlessly suppressed. In some ways, the new Iron Curtain is as impenetrable as during the Cold War. As the co-director of the Fletcher School's Russia and Eurasia program at Tufts University, I and my colleagues have maintained some unofficial dialogue with our Russian academic peers. These half-dozen or so meetings over the past 6 months have been both virtual and in person at neutral sites. They have included Russian scholars with close ties to the Putin administration. There has been a frank and full exchange of views with the aim of seeking mutual understanding. What we heard from our Russian counterparts was sobering, a mix of grievance, defiance, denial, acceptance, foreboding, and hope about the future. The Russian scholars we spoke with, more than a dozen in all, were far from homogeneous in their assessments about the current state of affairs. There was acknowledgement of some difficulties that Russia would face in the coming years. There were a few points on which they agreed, but whether those claims hold up under scrutiny is very much subject to debate. Some of those questionable claims were distracting rather than significant. For example, there was a surprisingly strong embrace of Russian President Vladimir Putin's cancel culture claims about the West, extrapolating from occasional overreaches during the first month of the war and making it sound like Western civilization wants to censor all Russian art and culture. But there has been one force that has helped keep Western resolve from fraying: Russia itself. The country's vicious prosecution of the war has been the most reliable factor in preventing any wavering. Reported war crimes in Izium, Bucha, Mariupol, and the Donbas offer a constant reminder to outside observers of Russian bellicosity. Indiscriminate missile attacks on Kharkiv, Kyiv, and Odessa also provide periodic lessons about the crude nature of Russian methods and ambitions. This problem will persist for Putin; indeed, his domestic strategy necessitates it. In order to maintain public support for the war, Putin has little choice but to amp up Russian rhetoric and actions in ways guaranteed to inflame the West. This leads to a bevy of quotes that make the Russians look positively genocidal. Deputy Chair of Russia's Security Council Dmitry Medvedev's Telegram account is littered with inflammatory comments about redrawing Europe's borders, including one warning that Ukraine may lose what's left of its state sovereignty and disappear from the world map. In one interview, Foreign Affairs Minister Sergei Lavrov suggested that it was possible that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky could be a Nazi even if he was Jewish. In June, Vladimir Putin compared himself to Peter the Great, explaining that it is also our lot to return what is Russia's. Such statements ricochet around the Western world and dim Russian hopes for a Western public demanding accommodation with Moscow. Recent polling continues to show rock-solid support in the West for countering Russia in Ukraine. In a September poll, 70% of Germans approved of supporting Ukraine even if it means higher energy prices. In an August poll, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs found that 72% of Americans support providing additional arms and military supplies to the Ukrainian government. 58% also agreed that the United States should support Ukraine for as long as it takes. This Russian narrative underestimates the autonomy that elected leaders have in managing national security. The strength of the French presidency ensures that Emmanuel Macron, who just won re-election to another 5-year term, will maintain continuity in French foreign policy regardless of parliamentary control. Elizabeth Truss, Boris Johnson's successor in 10 Downing Street, appears committed to sustaining British support for Ukraine. As for the United States, even a Republican wave in November would almost certainly have no effect on U.S. support for Ukraine. The Biden administration will be running foreign policy until at least January 2025. For all the Russian talk about outlasting the West, it is far from clear whether Russia can fight a 3-year war. By 2025, global commodity markets will likely have adjusted to the sanctions on Russia, and Europe should be independent of Russian energy and Russian economic leverage. Even our Russian counterparts acknowledged that the energy link between Russia and Europe would be completely severed. Meanwhile, Russia's civilian economy will face continued strangulation from sanctions. Things can change, of course. A harsh winter, some battlefield reversals, and more tumult within their governments could rattle Western resolve. But as of now, it's the Russian belief in the weak West that's proven unfounded. China will be Russia's lifeline? When pushed on questions about economic competitiveness and technological change, the Russians we spoke with always had a rhetorical out: even if Western sanctions take their bite, China will be Russia's Black Knight. The Russians are convinced that China will compensate for any short-term hits caused by the sanctions. Moscow's strategic partnership with Beijing will allow for a thriving trade in technology and natural resources. One Russian scholar stated that until now, Russia had been the brake on bilateral technical cooperation, no longer. According to this narrative, even if the next decade is a difficult one, by 2032 the United States will be powerless to stop the Sino-Russian axis. As one Russian scholar explained to me, "You have been declining for a long time." There are some valid reasons for Russian elites to believe this. China is a technological powerhouse, although its prowess in cutting-edge technologies might be a bit exaggerated. And just before the invasion, Russia and China agreed to a joint statement asserting that friendship between the two states has no limits, there are no forbidden areas of cooperation. Little wonder that Chinese leader Xi Jinping's first foreign visit since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic included meeting with Putin at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Samarkand, Uzbekistan, last week. Sounds like a pretty cozy relationship. As the war has progressed, however, some hard limits to that friendship have also been revealed. China has offered some rhetorical support at the United Nations. Beijing has also been happy to increase its purchases of Russian oil, at a steep discount, much as it did when Iran faced Western sanctions a decade ago. But as Russian stores of artillery and other military equipment have run low, Chinese firms have been reluctant to run afoul of the U.S. sanctions imposed after the invasion. To be sure, some Chinese firms have been hit with sanctions for trading with Russia, but those are the exception and not the rule. China is not providing material support, one senior U.S. official explained to Reuters over the summer. "We have not seen the PRC, People's Republic of China, engage in systematic evasion or provide military equipment to Russia." Even its rhetorical support has limits, as Putin discovered last week at the Uzbekistan summit, where he acknowledged that China had expressed concern to him about Russia's war, an unusually public admission of an ally's wariness. This is not surprising. From Beijing's perspective, Russia's invasion has generated unwanted attention on whether China would attempt something similar in Taiwan. Chinese officials have expressed frustration to me at the bind Russia has put them in. China has an obvious strategic interest in keeping Moscow as an ally, but Beijing's economic relationship with the United States and European Union dwarfs that with Russia. For all the talk of economic decoupling between China and the United States, Chinese exports to the West surged to record levels last year. China has no interest in sabotaging its great power neighbor, but neither does it have any interest in disrupting its own position in the global economy. As Carnegie Endowment for International Peace Vice President Evan Feigenbaum put it, the fact is, China is mainly pro-China, not pro-anyone else. And the more that Russia relies on China as a lifeline, the less it will be viewed as an independent great power. There has already been a raft of articles describing Russia as the junior partner in the Sino-Russian relationship, a claim that rankles any Russian old enough to remember when China was viewed as the subordinate state. Russia desires global prestige as much as it does great power status. Growing ever more dependent on China will not help in that regard. As my Fletcher colleague Chris Miller notes in his book We Shall Be Masters, Russia has periodically believed it could pivot to the East in response to difficulties in the West. This gambit has never turned out well. China may well be Russia's friend on paper, but our Russian colleagues' confident projections of a rescue is unlikely to pan out.